This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Aaron Kimberly and Aaron Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans. Christina Buttons is an independent journalist who writes about gender, pseudoscience, mental health, autism, and critical thinking. She advocates for early autism screening and education, and a model of transition care that prioritizes thorough, individualized assessments that explore gender-related distress. Here is our conversation with Christina.
Welcome back to Transparency, everyone. I'm Aaron Kimberly here with my co-host Aaron Terrell, and we're really delighted to have Christina Buttons with us here today, who's recently joined our team as an advisor on the heels of an article that she wrote about the connection between gender dysphoria and autism, which was a fascinating and really helpful article. So thanks so much for being here with us, Christina.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really like what you guys are doing.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
You're doing.
Yeah, you've written quite a number of really fantastic articles on the topic. And actually, before we talk about your your most recent article about autism, you had been writing for the Daily Wire until recently, and then decided to leave them. I wonder if maybe we could start with that, because you did write some really great articles for them. But it sounds like there was a bit of a rift there. Can you just kind of explain to us what had happened?
Yeah, well, I'm not, your typical kind of person you'd expect to be writing for a conservative news outlet. I come from the left. I'm, I guess what you would call kind of disaffected from the Democrat Party, because of how they've endorsed the affirmative model of care and pediatric medical transition. And it was mainly like the reporting that I saw coming from mainstream media that didn't add up. And I thought there was a real need for, like objective and, fair reporting on these issues. So that I was approached by a few different conservative outlets to write for them. And the Daily Wire asked me to, exclusively cover this issue, and that seems like something I was open to doing. I liked what they had done with the What is a Woman movie, where it didn't come and it wasn't aggressive. It didn't like try to insult anybody. It just sort of let other people talk and sort of show what they think. And I thought that was clever. So I was open to working with them in the beginning. But there were things that made me uncomfortable and want to leave eventually.
What kind of things were you seeing in the Daily Wire?
Like in the last few months, people I've noticed it all across the board too with conservatives. I understand their frustration and their fear. Like, I get it. Like, when a lot of these people have children and they feel overwhelmed by what they see on their timelines, and they just sort of veer into this extreme belief where it's all transgender people or transsexual people are bad. And when they start dunking on people, it didn't really feel very productive. I feel like we have a lot of great arguments and we have evidence on our side. I just don't feel like it's necessary or helpful to the situation to play into what the left says about the right. Like, they're all anti-trans, transphobes. It's like, just don't give that to them. So I think there's a better way to go about it. I'd rather just stick to the facts.
Yeah, agreed.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so seems so counterproductive, that approach that they're taking. Yeah, like you're saying, you're handing it back to the left, saying, "Yep, you're right. These are just hateful bigots." You can see by the way that they're acting, by the way that they're um, engaging, that that's where they're coming from, and it's not a place of
Mhm.
genuine concern. It's just um, yeah, an expression of bigotry, and
Yeah.
they're
I just
yeah.
saw a post last night by a prominent influencer, conservative influencer, that was justifying, yes, I'm transphobic. We should be transphobic because, they're all like this. They're all, I mean, comparing like the, I think the, the recent shooting in Nashville and sort of applying that across the board. Like I think that's wrong. Like you wouldn't do that to any population of people. You wouldn't accuse, all any particular group of a crime that a few individuals committed. Like it's just, this is just
Hmm.
basic stuff,
Hmm.
you
Yeah, and
know.
there are people who also seem like they were more nuanced and had a more holistic approach to all this, and then the more yeah, I mean, I think it is in response, obviously, to the radicalization, or the kind of the extremist approach of the left faction of activists. A lot of the people who were more kind of nuanced and reasonably gender critical have become basically just hardcore transphobes in response. It doesn't jive with what thought I understood of that person, or these people previously. But anyway, that's a yeah, going on a
Reminds
tirade
me
there.
a little bit of like what happened in 2020 when people on the left saw instances of like police brutality in their timelines perpetually and came to believe that we had like a racism pandemic and took to the streets. And what happened after that. I mean, it also is, our social media timelines. If you're in a
Yeah.
gender critical space, you're only going to see the worst kinds of people, the worst behavior. And then you come to believe, like, oh my God, this is overwhelming. They're all like this. And they forget, like, there are millions of people who call themselves transgender or transsexual. Like, it's not a representative sample of the whole population of people. And I feel like this is important to remind others of. It's,
Definitely.
Yeah, I mean, I
yeah.
think that the average, what I would call transsexual, people that are just trying to integrate into society. I mean, we're not don't tend to be the ones that people hear from because we're just getting on with our lives and we're trying to integrate into society, right? So we're not holding a big banner and we're not trying to disrupt our communities and our society. And so we're not, I think we're probably the majority,
Mhm.
but we're a silent majority because we're just working and raising our families and getting on with our lives, right? And so those that have that seem to thrive on creating disruption and needing attention, and they're the ones that get all the media attention and really
Mhm.
misrepresent the
Exactly.
average person.
And I feel like it comes at a personal cost too, to be like a voice of reason in a community that's like increasingly becoming more unreasonable. Like I mean, I try to have some moderate, reasonable views sometimes and sort of apply like the same criticism across the board to everybody. And sometimes those takes come at a personal cost. Like it it ruins my day. If I'm like responding to people misrepresenting my views online, and you lose hundreds of followers, like it's not, it comes at a personal cost. So it's like, why would I do that, like it, if unless it's something you really are passionate about.
I do follow Matt Walsh, and I mean some of his stuff. He's definitely more conservative than I am. I would say more central, but he's produced some stuff that I agreed with, that I thought was pretty
Hmm.
tasteful. And then, but it does seem like recently he's becoming more and more extreme in his views. And I don't know if that's a tactical strategy. I don't know if he's just becoming radicalized by media or what that is. But I mean, just as an example, one of his posts was quoting scripture that Jesus had said to the disciples, anyone who harms children, it would be better for him to be drowned in the sea. And he said, but if I ever said that about any of these trans activists, you would come after me
naturally.
as being really, really evil. But that's such a distortion of scripture. Like, even if that's what you believe, and I am a Christian, but that's such a distortion of scripture, because Jesus never told his disciples, see that sinner over there, I want you to drown him. That wasn't the message. There's no example of the disciples going around murdering people because they were sinners. So this idea that, because that seemed to be the shift for him of rather than talking about generalities and ideologies, that he started targeting individuals in his messaging, and really going after individuals. And so that seems to be his justification for it. And I don't know I think if he's using scripture to justify going after individuals and targeting individuals, I really think he needs to go back to his Bible and actually read it and understand it.
I see him and the other Daily Wire personalities are constantly conflating gender ideology with gender dysphoria, and they say, oh, it's a delusion. I don't want to support any kind of delusion of any kind. I've noticed that a lot.
Yeah, I'm noticing that more and more. It seems that more and more people are saying gender dysphoria doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And I fault trans activists for that, because it's really,
they're saying the same thing.
The trans activists have wanted to erase that, our understanding and our knowledge of gender dysphoria from the books as well, saying, well, this isn't pathology, this is just natural diversity. So we've got both sides denying that gender dysphoria exists. And so here we are, the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, trying to educate about what and trying to understand ourselves what gender dysphoria is. It's really frustrating when it seems like the majority of people out there don't even believe that gender dysphoria exists.
Yeah, you're right. And that it's true. Activists have had a hand in trying to sort of remove it as like a meaningful diagnosis and veer towards, it being like an identity or something like that, and that anybody can sort of just self-identify into. It's like the definition of transgender now is changed, and like our major institutions are defining it as like an umbrella term that just sort of encompasses mere non-conformity to stereotypes about sex, and it's like that includes everybody. Anybody who wants to be seen that way. So it's I think what you guys are doing is really cool and important.
One of the things that I've noticed recently too, a bit of a shift, is people going after the word gender dysphoria. Like, gender dysphoria doesn't exist because gender doesn't exist. So it's coming from the gender abolitionists. But I didn't create the label for gender dysphoria. I mean, that's not just something that we created and made up and we're calling it I mean, I don't really like the term gender dysphoria either. I think sex dysphoria makes more sense to me, but we didn't create that label. And I am a healthcare provider. I can't start making up labels for diagnosis. I have to use the labels that exist, and gender dysphoria is what it was named in the DSM. And so I feel like that's what we have to use. If we start making up words, then
people won't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, no one knows. And both sides, the gender criticals and the trans activists, are always playing this language game of making up their own terms all the time. And so we're trying to avoid that by just saying, well, this is what it's called, whether we like it or not. That's how it's listed as a diagnostic category, and that's what we're gonna use. But
no, I think that's a great idea. You're reclaiming it. I think that's something that's needed.
So as far as sorry, go ahead, Aaron.
I was just gonna kind of throw a spanner in here. Why aren't you trans, Christina?
I'm quite certain I would have been if this were around when I was a teenager. I mean, when the belief that if you don't conform to sex-based stereotypes, you're transgender. I mean, I'm not transgender because I don't have gender dysphoria, but I had some kind of body dysmorphia when I was a teenager, for sure. And I think if someone had introduced the idea to me, like, oh, all your problems are because you were born in the wrong body, I think I would have latched onto that. And I feel pretty certain of that.
Your article about how autism traits can be mistaken for gender dysphoria, I mean, I found that very informative. I really appreciated how you outlined that, especially towards the end of that article. And we'll link your article to our liner notes so people can check that out. But towards the end, you really kind of listed out very specific things, specific traits of autism that could lead someone to gender dysphoria. And I thought that was really insightful and informative and helpful. And I learned a lot from that. Erin and I have both neither of us have ever been diagnosed with autism, but we've had a number of guests on that have been, who've talked about their symptoms. And the more I learn about it, the more I kind of wonder if I'm somewhere on the spectrum.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
There are, I mean, I've talked to a lot of detransitioners. I began writing about these issues, because I felt a strong connection to detransitioners. So many of them are also finding out that they're on the spectrum. And I know what that's like, because when I was a teenager, I didn't receive a diagnosis until I was 30. And I always felt like something was wrong with me, and I was always looking for an explanation, and I was trying on all kinds of different diagnoses to sort of see what fit. And I can see how easily someone might come to believe that they might have gender dysphoria if they don't. But I mean, it's different for everybody. Has a different experience. It's, for some people it works, and for others it doesn't. But I feel like an earlier autism diagnosis might help people sort of figure out what is going to work for them.
Will you talk about those specific traits that you outline in the article?
Yeah. Well, I said that some of the attributes that can lead to confusion over their gender include sort of their identity issues, rigid or black and white thinking, intense and restricted interests, gender nonconforming behavior, social difficulties, and which come with sort of like a preference for online socialization, and incongruence with their body, and other kind of comorbidities.
I mean, there is a fairly well-established relationship between gender dysphoria and autism. I mean, that's been in the literature now for quite a number of years, and I don't think anyone. I mean, there's hypotheses about what that relationship is, but no one's ever really nailed that down. And it's amazing to me that screening for autism isn't just standard practice when people come to gender clinics. It's knowing that correlation is so strong, you would think that would be just part of the upfront screening process to if someone doesn't already have a diagnosis, to do the screening and do a diagnosis. But it's surprisingly difficult to get a diagnosis, especially for adults. I mean, with children, and I'm sure it's different in various places, but in BC, children could get an autism assessment done for free. It was covered by our provincial health plan, but there's usually only maybe one person in a city that can do the assessments, and so the wait lists are ridiculously long. And for adults, it's very difficult to get screening done, and you have to pay out of pocket something like $3,000 to get the assessment.
Oh, wow.
So you got an assessment as an adult. So was that covered by your insurance plan, or did you have to pay for that out of pocket?
Yeah, no, at the time I was living in California, and that was covered. Yeah, I saw a psychiatrist and I got a diagnosis then. But for people who do not, I mean, I'm not sure if this is entirely responsible, but maybe partly responsible, when Asperger's was sort of merged into an autism spectrum disorder, I think like in 2013. I mean, a lot of people associate autism with an intellectual disability, and so they might not realize that they have Asperger's or that they're on the spectrum. And so they might not look for it. And for girls especially too, I mean, it was autism until recently was thought of as sort of like a boy's diagnosis, and the sex ratio was believed to be sort of, 4 males to every 1 female. And now they're realizing it might be a lot more evenly matched than previously believed. And that's because females tend to mask their symptoms better, and their interests are a little bit less obscure. They tend to be more have fixed interests that have to do more with like people or animals, things that don't seem, stereotypically autistic, like, train schedules
Trains.
and things like that. That's everybody's favorite example. I mean, there are autistic guys like that, like train schedules. So yeah, they tend to fly under the radar and not get a diagnosis sometimes until adulthood. And what they know that they're different from everybody else, and they want an explanation for why. Because I mean, for me personally, I've always been kind of like a very problem solution oriented. So I was always like, thinking if I could just figure out what it is, then I could get treated for it, and then I can have a normal life and blend in and make friends and be like everybody else. And it became really important to me to figure out what it was. But I had all kinds of different explanations that didn't really seem to fit. And then I finally, it was 30 when I got a diagnosis, and everything made sense. My entire life made sense after that. And it's vastly improved too, having a diagnosis. And it doesn't, I mean, I don't let autism sort of interfere with my life. It's not a huge central part of my identity. It's helpful for other people to know that I have it. But it also, like, I learned to deal with it, and I don't let it interfere with my life. So
Are you finding that there are supports and resources that have been helpful now that you have that diagnosis?
resources, I mean, there's a lot more people talking about it now. There's a lot more resources than there used to be even a few years ago. There's a lot more research being conducted into it, but there definitely needs to be more. And I mean, I really think kids would benefit getting screened for it earlier.
One of the things that made me kind of solidify the serious differences between male and female psychology was reading about the different presentations of autism or ASD in boys versus girls. It becomes very, very, even though obviously they're exhibiting, it's sort of like the baseline same neurodivergent issue, or however you want to phrase that. But yeah, how it presents, how that is experienced is so different actually between the boys and the girls. And again, it's at toddlerhood and younger. So it's not something, or a little later. It's not something that could reasonably be explained as socially or like developmentally learned. Was just really, really fascinating to me. Like yeah, like you said, the girls having these same kind of fixed obsessive interests, but they go under the radar because they're just less weird and obscure than the boys' interests. And girls are much more naturally socially minded and socially concerned. So they're going to be automatically altering their behavior and trying to mimic their peers and fit in with their peers to not be socially ostracized. Whereas the boys, they'll feel the bullying and the ramifications of not fitting in socially, but it doesn't innately occur to them to try to learn how to fit in, whereas it does for girls. I remember, so again, one of the things that makes me realize, okay, I probably am on the spectrum is, and I used to use this as concrete explanation of why, I had a male brain. Was that growing up, I used to always watch girls and figure out how they were behaving and why they were doing it, and just trying to mimic everything that they were doing as kind of like, and I saw it and looking back is like I was observing them like an anthropologist, not like I was one of them. And so obviously in my gender immersed brain, it's like, oh, obviously that's because I had a male brain. You know, I was really a boy who was trying to
Oh,
learn how to be a girl. When no, really, I was probably just a an aspie kid trying to figure out how to be a normal kid.
that makes
But yeah,
sense.
again, that's self-diagnosing, so take it with a grain of salt.
No, I mean that lines up with a lot of what I was thinking too, where even if you don't feel like you fit in with your peers, you might feel like you fit in with the opposite sex better.
Well, yeah, yeah,
And
boys were just so much easier to yeah, they're so much easier.
yeah, I had that experience too growing up. I didn't fit in with groups of girls, and my preference was for hanging out with guys. They were much easier to deal with.
Yep, you
When
build
Jordan,
forts, play
when Jordan,
sports.
yeah, I don't know if you either of you saw the interview that Jordan Peterson did with Chloe Cole, but he talked about
Yeah.
autism and how girls with autism tend to have more male pattern, male typical interests, like more interested in objects and things than in people, which I definitely related to. I mean, I was much more, I would rather go ride horses or draw or work with my hands with objects. I always feel so much relief, emotional relief, because I feel socially anxious a lot, but I feel so much relief just having working with my hands, like doing woodworking or drawing or creating something. It just feels tangible and real because I can float in my head with such abstract stuff, to my peril. Um, so how he was describing autism in girls made sense to me, that because if your interests are more male typical, you would naturally gravitate to hanging out with boys who are also interested in things more than people. And so that definitely mapped onto my childhood experience.
Yeah, that makes sense too. I mean, autism can sort of present in all different kinds of ways, and it's a lot more common than we once realized.
I
I think
And
I
if we start doing the whole like screening for autism, because people are like, oh, there's this weird overlap between autism and gender dysphoria, and let's figure out what is autism before we can diagnose that is gender dysphoria. Honestly, I think the vast majority of gender dysphoria is a result of autism spectrum traits. I don't think it's a case of, oh, which is which. I think it's very much a case of the one creating the other, and I don't think gender dysphoria creates autism. I'll put it that way.
And that's how I used
Sorry,
to see
yeah,
it, though. I used to think
right.
because I'm gender dysphoric, social interactions are awkward, and so I didn't develop social skills. That's how I always read it for my entire life, is that the primary issue was gender dysphoria that created autistic like traits because I avoided social situations.
well, here's something I sort of was thinking about last night. Um, so gender dysphoria too, it's like, let me see if I can figure out how to word this. With gender dysphoria, you know, it's an explanation, but it's also a solution. So like if
Yeah.
you're diagnosed with something like autism or bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder, you know, there's not really like a viable treatment solution, cure, fix for that. But if we're talking about like gender dysphoria, you know, you get the diagnosis, you have the explanation for why you're feeling distress and you're unhappy with life, and then you transition, and then that's the
Hmm.
fix. And you view so many videos online of people YouTube, on TikTok, who are happy after they transition, and they describe euphoria, and it's a very like attractive diagnosis for some people, I think, because the the outcomes for many other explanations or disorders out there, like they're not as they don't I think you know what I'm saying. Like they
they don't offer anything.
Yeah, I mean, it's like you can be on medication for the rest of your life, but you're still just sort of like out there. I'm gonna write an article about this, so I'm gonna have a better way of describing it. This was just sort of something I thought of last night.
It's a really
No,
good point. Yeah.
it is. Yeah, yeah. Like so all these different diagnoses, yeah, they offer an explanation. Okay, great. So this explains why I feel this way or why I've always been like this. Okay, I can take this medication, and like say schizophrenia or situations like that where there is a medication. But
Yeah, you're just sort of
so
on
that
your
it's not
own.
like,
It's like go happy,
yeah,
here's a medication, good luck.
yeah, yeah,
But it's still you're still left with, I mean, I'm somebody who had pretty severe depression growing up, especially just out of not knowing how to manage life or function at the level of my peers and really low self-esteem. But changing your thinking, through cognitive behavioral therapy is really helpful. But like changing your thinking patterns, it's like thoughts that you've had your entire life. That's really hard work. It takes a lot of work. Um, to catch the cognitive distortions and to tell yourself, no, I'm not going to go down this spiral into sadness. And stoic philosophy actually really helped me too, which I think is like what cognitive behavioral therapy is sort of like influenced by, and just not letting things affect you, not allowing yourself to have an emotional response to something and being in control. I found that really helpful, but it's also really hard work. And so I think for a lot of people who have stuff going on with them, whatever it may be, I feel like gender dysphoria or being transgender can be kind of an attractive diagnosis because it explains everything, and it also offers an actual like treatment and solution. Once you transition, you'll be better, you'll be in the right body, you'll be whole, or whatever. There's a lot of appeal to it, I think, that um that other diagnoses don't seem to have. And there's also like a whole, you get a community embrace you, and
yeah,
all of the other things. So
yeah. It
there's
comes with a whole community, a whole political movement, like a righteous holy war to affiliate
Mhm.
yourself with, along with the diagnosis and the solution. And it's like it's no wonder. I think in one of our earlier episodes we described it as like it's a black hole. It's like anything that can make especially a young person feel distress about their body, or they're or being isolated, or not really knowing how to fit in, or yeah, because of say neurodivergence or a mental health disorder or whatever. It catches everything, and yeah, as you're saying, it provides the solution and a whole yeah, it solves your isolation, yeah, as well.
Mhm. So that's one of the things I think is sort of contributing to this sort of, I mean, there's a lot of, or there's millions of people now who have adopted a transgender identity, whether or not they actually have gender dysphoria. Um, that's one of the reasons, I think.
And these days, the messaging is very overt that you don't need gender dysphoria to be trans. And
Mhm.
there's a website, one of our health authorities website about trans health. It even goes as far as to say you don't even have to be trans to access gender affirming care. So it just
Yeah.
seems like that black hole that you described, Aaron, that black hole is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. It's like at this point, it's like, the idea of gatekeeping is seen as so sacrilegious that now it's
It's
just opened up to
safeguarding. Yeah, they
whatever, any
call it
reason.
gatekeeping, but it's like, I mean, these are safeguards that are put in place to help prevent people from making mistakes, and so that you have more time to think about these decisions. I mean, I think gender dysphoria too, even in the DSM, I think it says that you only need to have it for 6 months, I think.
Mhm.
I mean, does that seem like a short amount of time.
That seems like a very short amount of time. I mean, not many people have access to the DSM. So most people can see, I mean, you can look up online the diagnostic criteria, but what most people don't have access to is the descriptive part of the chapter after that, bullet form diagnostic criteria, where they
Yeah.
actually do describe the different developmental pathways to gender dysphoria. And that's
Oh.
where they do describe the childhood onset, which is correlated with homosexuality and autogynephilia, and then a small number of people with DSDs decide to change their sex, so those three pathways are pretty well articulated in that chapter, but that's not the part that the public has access to. And
Yeah, I actually haven't read it.
it's funny
I'm
to
only
me.
familiar with the bullet points.
So it's funny to me when we talk about these different developmental pathways, you kind of get two different reactions. The trans activists say that's just bogus and debunked. And then you got the other side saying, wow, what a radical new idea. It's like, but it's right there in the DSM.
It's been there all along.
It's been there all along.
Wow.
Yeah. So the idea, like the 6 months gender dysphoria, I mean, which developmental pathway would that apply to? Because you've got the childhood onset, which usually starts around age 3, that most of those kids, have it for many, many years and outgrow it through adolescence. So that doesn't really fit with a 6-month gender dysphoria. So and then the autogynephilic type, which would emerge in adolescence, I don't know. And I mean, could that develop into gender dysphoria in a 6-month period? Like, I just try to think of which of these developmental pathways justifies only a 6-month onset of gender dysphoria. So that doesn't really correlate to me.
I think Lisa Littman coined a term that describes it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, that's the only one.
But it doesn't exist.
Well, I think the other maybe they'll write another developmental pathway is autism. But we can I can try to explain some of those more. So with like the rigid thinking is back to what I was saying before about there's autistic people in general tend to like sort of simplistic explanations for things, and what I was saying earlier about being transgender is that explanation, transition is the solution. And that
Yeah, I think the rigid thinking aspect I think is very relevant, because one of the things that the trans ideology provides is this very sort of simplistic framework to understand their experience, right? If they just, and we've talked about this a little bit on our podcast before with some of the kids that are really lonely, and they see this community where there's like this set of rules. If you just use these right pronouns, and so you just kind of memorize these pronouns and behave and think this certain way, it is very rigid and prescriptive. And if they just learn a set of rules, then they have access to this peer group. I can see the appeal for someone struggling with social skills.
And the special interests too. I talked to about close to 50 detransitioners for the article I was writing. And what was interesting, most of them had not been diagnosed with autism until after the detransition, but 5 had a childhood diagnosis. But they all 5 told me that, that gender identity and transgender issues had become sort of a special interest for them. And they all told me that had they sort of known more about how autistic traits could present as gender dysphoria, they may never have believed themselves to be transgender at all, because they became sort of like fixated on this issue. I mean, a lot of people with autism struggle with identity, trying to figure out who they are, and they're looking for an explanation and a reason. And there's a lot of research too that shows that autistic people have more gender non-conforming traits and social difficulties, of course. Back to what I was talking about earlier with not fitting in with their peer group. and sort of gravitating towards the opposite sex.
I
The
was
gender,
seeing even before the whole trans explosion, and people were really seeing the correlation between autism and gender dysphoria, or people transitioning even before. So it was research from like there was a presentation I think I was watching from the mid 2000s sometime. They were basically saying that kids with autism, they just said, she straight up said, struggle with gender, like the concept of like your
Yes.
sex kind of correlates with a certain kind of role and behavior, and just kind of like just the very concept of gender was very difficult for autistic people to wrap their heads around, essentially.
Yeah, I mean, they say gender is a social construct anyway. A lot of people have different definitions for gender, but that's the popular narrative. Gender is a social construct, and autistic
And
people have.
that understanding of it really appeals to autistic people, right? Because it's like, oh, this is something that other people have decided on collectively. Like culturally, we've decided this is how it should be. Whereas I think a lot of people who are not autistic, it's more innately like you can kind of see it typically, like typically masculine behavior, typically feminine behavior that kind of sort of informs the way society is structured. Like typically women are much more wired towards children and people services, and um, like I think for a lot of let's say neurotypical people, that whole gender sex alignment just kind of makes intuitive sense, whereas I think it
Yeah,
doesn't so much for autistic people, for whom that, oh, it's a social construct, is going to appeal, I think.
yeah, and there's also like a preference too for autistic people who struggle with sort of in-person communication to sort of gravitate towards online communities, and
Hmm.
the autism online community is very enmeshed in social justice themes. And I mean, I was part of the online autism community for a period of time, but I sort of, I got, it was a little, it was a little bit much. But I was also involved in like social justice online for part of the time during the pandemic. And one of the one of the things I mentioned in the article I wrote is that social rules aren't really usually made explicit, except in these online social justice communities. They have all of these like, pastel infographics
uh,
explaining all of these social rules that are like, oh, this makes sense. This is easy to follow. And a lot autistic people typically like rules. They provide like a sense of structure and predictability. Um, and so that's why I think they also tend to like these social justice communities that make everything very explicit and clear in all of their like social roles and their hierarchies, and no, like you can't say this to this person because they hold this kind of identity and this kind of identity. And it's I mean, people make all
it's a
kinds of
very good point.
infographics and to explain these things. um
is the gender nonconformity as common in the boys with autism as the girls with autism, do you think? Because I can think of some sort of famous examples of, like Temple Grandin, for example, is a very famous individual with autism, and she's very gender nonconforming, but I can't think of any famous men with autism that are equally gender nonconforming.
well, females actually in general tend to be more gender nonconforming than males. I think that's also my boyfriend Colin Wright wrote an article about this. The sex ratio flip in uh with people who identify as transgender. It used to be, predominantly males, and now there's a huge proportion of females who identify as transgender, and that's because there's a lot of females who are more gender nonconforming than males, and men maybe have to deal with some kind of um, socialization too. I think there's less room for males to be gender nonconforming. But I mean, there's a bunch of research into this about um, females being historically like more gender nonconforming, and now that the definition of transgender includes gender nonconformity, we're seeing a lot more people identify that way.
But I'm curious, how is that being defined? Like, what is male conformity and what is female conformity? I'd be interested to know, like what those parameters are in order to define what constitutes non-conformity. Because I think what one thing that really explains, one of the many things that explains the sex ratio flip in transgender identified young people is the hypersexualization of women, of girls, the like the you know, online, like the immense amount of hardcore porn that's just inundating, you know, young people. And like, I think for a lot of girls, this is one thing I harp on a lot about, is you could understand why seeing stuff like that, hardcore, you know, usually just really degrading, awful porn at like 12, 13 years old, is to be like, I don't want to be that, you know, like I want to opt out of that. And I think, and it's not just porn stuff. It's like, if you're on Instagram, it's like the what they call the Kardashianization of womanhood. You know, it's like just this kind of, you know, just everything so glossed up, and you know, you're meant to just be like, yeah, this sexy, well, it's a very old fashioned term, but pinup
Yeah.
doll, whatever, you know, like, and
Yeah.
I think wanting to just distance themselves from that is something that's really
Yeah.
appealing. And boys don't have to deal with that. They don't have to be like, you know, they do have to be, you know, obviously there's the pressure to be the, you know, the alpha Chad or whatever it is, but it's still, it's like, I
It's
think
an
it's very
opt
different.
out for people if they feel
Yeah.
like they can't compete within their sex, or if they feel like they don't measure up. I mean, this is something a lot of teenagers go through, feeling inadequate and insecure. I mean, adopting a transgender identity is sort of like an opt out. It's
Hmm.
and then I'm going to be something else. I'm if I don't feel like I'm measuring up within my sex, I can be something else. So
Yep.
there's that.
One of
It
the
does
things
appeal
that's,
to a lot of teenage boys too, though, who
yeah.
can't, who feel like, yeah, they aren't the Giga Chad, and so it's like, oh, I guess I'll just be a girl because I can't be, you know, the yeah, cream of the crop male. Anyway, sorry, go on, Aaron.
One of the things that I find fascinating is that autism is correlated with both types of gender dysphoria, both the homosexual childhood onset and AGP, and yet it
In
manifests.
females, so there's no correlation between autism spectrum disorder and homosexual, transsexual, and sexuality in males, but there is in
In
females. It looks
females.
like. Yeah.
And
Yep.
there's definitely a correlation between the AGP subtype of gender dysphoria and
Yeah.
autism.
Hardcore.
And
Yeah.
they tend to be, you know, really into tech. And so it's just interesting that, you know, you got these two developmentally different pathways to gender dysphoria, but they're both correlated with autism.
Oh, yeah, I didn't know that. I mean, I figured as much, but like I didn't know there was actual like research into it. I'd like to see that.
Yeah. The very strong correlation between yeah, autogynephilia and autism is, yeah, it's a pretty strong link. And I'm starting to kind of it seems to make sense why, like, that hyper internal focus that is uh uh autism, you know. I think that the kind of, it's kind of a theory I'm developing that I just don't have the credentials to develop, but I feel like I'm onto something. But like this kind of in turning inward, essentially, of
Yeah.
what should be an external drive. Um, uh, but yeah, the correlation between female homosexual transsexuality and autism, I don't know what that link is, other than the hyper conflation of sex nonconformity. That's the only thing that, like, where, because it's like, okay, you're both same sex attracted, and this whole gender thing is too complicated. It's like, okay, so I must be male. Um, is why that could make sense, but spitballing here.
Hmm. I wonder though if there are additional pathways that we haven't been able to sort of glean on yet, because it seems like there's so many people who have adopted a transgender identity now. I wonder if there's other pathways that research hasn't really like picked up on yet.
But I don't know that those don't necessarily have to do with gender dysphoria, right? There could be definitely a lot of, yeah, things that could contribute to it, but I think a lot of it too is just people feeling lonely and needing a cause, needing a explanation, and it appeals. Yeah, the identification appeals even independent of any sort of psychological body, incongruence.
But even in the childhood onset gender dysphoria cohort, in the classical sense before this explosion, I still think that there are nuances and different pathways within that have sort of been all sort of lumped together as one diagnosis. But I wouldn't think, because that's less in females, it's less correlated with homosexuality. It's still strongly correlated, but not as strongly correlated as with boys. So if you have all these straight girls and what will be gay girls both experiencing childhood onset gender dysphoria, I wouldn't think that those are the same thing. I don't think that they're the same gender dysphoria. I think one is related more to sexual orientation. And so I have less insight into, for the heterosexual girls, what would cause that gender dysphoria.
What about obsessive compulsive disorder? I know this isn't, I mean, some people have sort of made the connection between gender dysphoria and OCD before, but I tend to think of it as kind of a form of OCD almost. There's a whole bunch of like OCD related disorders, but if I'm imagining why if a child who feels like distress over their sex and they desire to be the other sex, like it almost feels like maybe it's kind of like an intrusive thought, like, or they're just feeling distress about something and they pick their biology and they pick something that they feel like, or that they focus on and fixate on, and they fixate on the desire to become the opposite sex. I almost wonder if that sort of can explain why some children feel gender dysphoric. I mean, this was different. My little boy likes, pink and sparkles and stuff like that. I better take him to the gender clinic. But I do wonder, like, historically, if OCD can kind of explain in a way, the thoughts that people have with gender dysphoria.
Probably for very similar reasons as autism, because they both tend to hyperfixate on once they latch onto certain ideas.
And I have OCD too, so I understand how it works. I'm not like a severe form of OCD, but I definitely have like things that I do that aren't logical that give me sort of like a sense of like calm, and it's just sort of a routine that I have to do, even though it doesn't make sense to anybody else.
And I worry, with the kids with autism, I mean, it seems like those with OCD, those targets of obsessive thinking tend to be fairly stable over time. Like, I'm trying to think of people that I've worked with OCD in the past, but yeah, their objects of fixation tends to be sometimes lifelong. It doesn't tend to change really rapidly, but with those with autism, that special interest can change overnight. Like, they can be totally, obsessed with something for a month, and then all of a sudden they find something else they're obsessed with and it shifts. So I really worry about those kids. If those are the kids that are, their special interest is gender and the whole trans ideology, I mean, as no matter how strongly they may feel about it today, give it a month and that could completely change, and now they've altered their body. And I worry about them most of all, because I think they could present to a gender clinic with that really strong drive and obsession and fixation on it, and I don't think clinicians, if they're not screening for autism and not seeing that intensity of that fixation as maybe being related to autism, they're not understanding that could very rapidly switch into some other special interest, and now you've permanently altered their body. So I can see how they could very quickly become detransitioners.
Yeah. I mean,
and that's what you were saying, Christina, the people that you talked to for that article, right? It's like, it was their special interest. And that's, yeah. Sorry, go on.
Oh, I was just gonna say too, like, yeah, my life can kind of be like categorized by my special interests throughout the years. They've definitely have changed as I've gotten older. And I think Dr. Kenneth Zucker too also made the same comparison. Like the special interests can explain why people are heavily fixated on gender identity and trans issues. There's so much, I mean, it's a very like rich culture and community now. Like there's endless hours of videos you can watch learning all about the experiences of other people. And I mean, even like queer theory, like there's countless like books and lectures they can really absorb themselves into if that was their special interest. If that was mine, I would probably do that, want to learn everything there is to know about it. So that's definitely something that
Mm-hmm.
Dr.
makes sense.
Dr. Bradley, the psychiatrist that used to work with Zucker at their clinic on Ontario, I mean, she's been speaking publicly. She's still in
Yeah.
practice, and she's been speaking publicly about this too, saying, we made a mistake. So there's two things that she said that stand out in my mind. One is about puberty blocker. She said, I don't think they're as reversible as we thought back
Mhm.
then. And two, she said, I think we really missed the autism piece. And I think a lot of these kids are just autistic. So it's amazing that she's in a position where now she can step forward and start speaking
Mhm.
publicly about it.
Yeah, and it's not to say that you can't be transgender and on the spectrum, of course. It's just we'd want to like rule out the false positives or people who aren't going to be, especially if they're young people, if they're not going to be happy transitioning. I mean, it's a lifelong for a lot of people, it's a lifelong thing. It's not something to be taken lightly, and you should screen for other things going on.
Well, especially if a young person either doesn't have a diagnosis of autism yet, so they don't know that is a factor, or they have been diagnosed, but they maybe don't know much about it. I can see
Mhm.
how it's not really informed consent then if you're not educating them. Like, okay, are you aware of, this is what autism means, and these are some of the traits. And because when you hear the detransitioners saying, well, I didn't understand my autism, or I didn't know I had autism, and
Yeah.
now that I understand it, I'm able to look back on my life and reframe all of those experiences through the
Yeah.
lens of my autism, and now it makes perfect sense. And I had mistaken that for gender dysphoria, which is what you speak to in your article. So it's not really informed consent then if we're not screening for autism and educating about what that means, so that people can make sense of their own experience. And then at least they can say, okay, I understand autism. I understand what you're saying. I understand my history of that, but I still think I have gender dysphoria. At least then it's informed consent.
Yeah. I mean, that's something that makes me angry too with the informed consent model is I hear from detransitioners they were like deliberately misinformed by the people that were supposed to care for them, like telling them, 13-year-old girl, you have a male brain and a female body. You have a medical condition that requires medical treatment. And I mean, that's so wrong. Or the emotional blackmail too, like the false dilemma. You can have a live son or a dead daughter. I mean, this is not how medicine should be
Mm-hmm.
practiced. It's totally wrong.
One part of the problems with the healthcare system for gender dysphoria now is activists have completely bullied out the mental health clinicians. So it tends to just be primary care, like family doctors doing the assessments now, or nurse practitioners, and so they've removed a lot of the mental health, like psychologists and psychiatrists and counselors, out of the system of care.
Yeah.
And so the people that are left doing this work aren't savvy in mental health. So they maybe don't have the skills to sort of understand what this looks like and frame this through a mental health lens.
Yeah, and it's really the affirmative model of care that I have a huge problem with. I mean, not medical transition altogether, just, the affirmative model of care. Um, it I mean, what they do in the Netherlands, like the Dutch model at least, I mean, it's still problematic, but it's uh at least involves like individualized and thorough assessments and, ruling out any other kind of um, psychiatric or neurodevelopmental disorders. And I mean, there's at least a process behind it. But here in the US with the affirmative model of care, it's like you come in and you say you're transgender. Okay, you're transgender. Here's 30 minutes later, you get a prescription for testosterone. That's the story we've heard so many times with detransitioners who walk into Planned Parenthood and walk out with a prescription. And they end up a lot of them times being autistic, and they self-diagnose with gender dysphoria because for all the reasons we explained. Yeah, there has to be another way. We
And
have to be able to convince US medical organizations to walk back this model and
because with the Dutch model, I mean, I know that there are always going to be people who disagree even with the Dutch model or transition in general. But that aside, I mean, with the Dutch model, with careful screening and a lot of mental health supports and social supports and a real robust system of care around people, we weren't seeing the same emotional and psychological instability in the trans population. We weren't seeing the societal problems that we're seeing now. I think a more robust system was actually supportive of us and our mental health going through this, because it's a complicated process. It's psychologically complicated. It's socially complicated, especially when our goal is to integrate. There's a lot of learning that goes along with that. And I think we really benefited from having more support. So it saddens me that, people like Matt Walsh are going after individual trans people when really it's the healthcare system that has done this to people. It's the healthcare. It's lied to us. It provided us with no support. It's not screening people properly. There's no emotional support, and now people are targeting trans people for being unstable or not coping well or being inappropriate. But where has the support been? Like most people don't even understand what gender dysphoria is. Like trans people, because they don't tell you when you go for gender affirming care, nobody sits down with you and explains, okay, what you're experiencing is gender dysphoria. You maybe have the AGP subtype, and there's no education about what that is. And so how can you blame a population of people who have been medicalized with no information, no screening, no supports, and then wonder why they're unstable?
Yeah. But the thing is, like, I mean, this is what I want to inform people about, but one of the problems I see in like conservative media is, it's not entertaining. And so that's why they dunk on trans people because it's entertainment for them, but it's not helping the situation at all, especially not when the US medical organizations, they hold all the power. So like you can ban, gender affirming care in red states all you want, but there are far more people being affected by the affirmative model care in blue states, and they're only going to change course if the US-based medical orgs, walk back the affirmative model of care and favor individualized assessments. And I feel like, we have a lot of evidence on our side. We have the better arguments. We have the moral high ground. It's like, just use that. But, it's not conducive to a business model that, turns these like really hot political topics into entertainment. And I mean, Dylan Mulvaney, this is somebody that they tend to talk about a lot. Definitely definitely deserves some criticism for sure, but like this is a person who's like a TikTok influencer. I mean, I think most TikTok influencers have that kind of annoying big personality or whatever, but this is someone who puts out content every day. And I just wonder, like, someone should put like a counter to how many days the Daily Wire can go without talking about Dylan Mulvaney, because every day it seems like it's back to zero. I just don't think this person's that important to,
There's definitely
the problems that we're seeing. If we're talking about pediatric medical transition and the affirmative model of care, women's sports and women's prisons. Like these are all like really important issues that reasonable people would definitely agree with. I mean, depending on how you present it to them, but it's hard to get people on your side when they just keep, making things more difficult.
They're
by,
definitely more
yeah.
malicious and dangerous characters than Dylan.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, Dylan's definitely over the top and annoying and very. Matt Walsh did nail it when he said, that Dylan, even prior to transition, was very over the top, performative and attention seeking,
Yeah.
and really has created a life around being, probably in his mind, an entertainer, right?
Yeah.
It's very performative way of going through life, that probably it has nothing to do with gender dysphoria. It's probably that the transition probably serves the purpose of, well, this really fits with my goals of being highly performative, and it gets me a lot of attention and infamy. But
Right,
there's
and
definitely
maybe
people
instead of
more harmful than someone who's just over the top performative.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then also for somebody who's so pathologically driven by attention, it was the healthcare providers in Dylan's transition that should have screened for, oh wait, is this driven out of a pathological need for external attention and validation and not some internal anyway, I like that,
Yeah.
anyway.
They just make Dylan more famous and revered by and protected by the left. That's why Dylan's getting to go on on daytime talk shows now and stuff like that. Like they're making this person
A martyr.
more famous and more loved, and it's
Yeah.
Dylan would be completely harmless if the institutions in place, whether the medical, the entertainment institution, the social media institutions, like if those institutions weren't in place, Dylan would be harmless. Dylan wouldn't have a platform. So it's the institutions that I wish, the Matt Walshes of the world would go after, not the individuals who are maybe misguided and misinformed and not very likable people, but would be harmless without the institutions that are propping that behavior up. But anyway,
Sure.
thank you so much for your time today. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. Yeah, it's looking forward to working with you guys.
Yeah, likewise. Welcome to our team.
Cool.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.